chaps. Now, today we're going to start our conversation by talking about British rule in Egypt. So does anyone want to talk to me about what the British aims and intentions were, how successful they were, and also conversely about Arab aims and intentions and how successful they were in materialising those aims? Anyone? Go on,
Okay, so the main motive, especially for the British when it came to Egypt, was they'd finally built and perfected, I think around in the 1880s, the Suez Canal. And at this point, this made trade significantly easier, as it drastically shortened the period that they could sort of be trading with India and things like that to Britain. So it became one of the most sort of strategically important assets in the entire world. And because Britain had that in their portfolio, they were very, very keen to protect it. And then later on, as we'll see, when the discovery of oil starts to happen, it becomes even more important in terms of accessing and fueling both the British Navy and even Britain itself.
Yeah, it's a great point you actually make, Lucian, especially if we consider the fact that at this time India was still a British Imperial colony, and thus, because it constituted such a large part of Britain's economy, around 50% really of Indian exports comprising the British GDP, the Suez Canal was vital for Britain to have control over. And that's why their activities in Egypt are largely focused around it. Because, of course, if the British did not have the Suez Canal, they would have to travel around the Horn of Africa to sort of transport goods from India to the mainland. But the Suez Canal has, for a long time, been a mark of British imperialism, even stretching into the 1950s. I believe you want to talk about that, Harry.
Maybe later on.
Excellent.
I'll bring it.
Okay, so now I think it's a good idea to talk about Arab aims for Egypt at the time. Does anyone want to talk about those?
I'd rather talk about. I was quite passionate on some of the failures with Egypt and protecting of Egypt.
Go on.
So I think that the failures of the widespread nationalist reaction in 1919, led by the man himself, Saad Zaghloul, and the WAF, showed British inability to combine control with legitimacy. Britain unilaterally, the unilateral declaration of Egyptian independence, left the reserve powers in British hands, effectively a limited independence and long-term grievance. So I feel like a lot of the time with Britain, their imperial grasp is so strong that it often destabilises whole regions when let go. And I think that even connecting into later on with Standard Oil, an American company in the 1930s, sort of taking the reins almost.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about independence there, because with Egyptian independence, it's sort of different to how we generally think of independence. So it's not from the British that they declared independence, but rather from the Ottomans. And in terms of the actual realpolitik within Egypt, there was no change in who was really running the show. It was the British. And the main reason that they declared independence in a kind of formal sense is because the British were aware of the fact that there was a large amount of nationalist feeling in Egypt, especially after the arrest, like you've said, of Saad Zaghloul, which resulted in widespread violent protest within Egypt. And what the British essentially did there is said, well, okay, if we can sell this idea to the people of Egypt that they are somehow independent because they're formally independent, they're not under a formal colonial British system, we can still control the Suez Canal and fulfill our aims whilst also not incurring the wrath of nationalist movements.
So just to continue with that, I think a key piece of context that should also be mentioned is that in the decline of the sick man of your Ottoman Empire, the nationalism clearly provided a key antidote at this time to the Arabs living in Egypt, as many of them were frustrated with the sort of disappointments that their country had been facing in the last couple of centuries, and because of this, when they felt they were effectively going from one empire to another, I think this was a key straw of grievance and disappointment for the Egyptian people.
Right, excellent. Now I think we should move on to Iraq. Does anyone want to have any comments about British rule in Iraq, specifically from 1919 to 1939, let's say?
I guess I'll go again. One of the key things to understand about Iraq was as the current state that it was, there wasn't really the same as within Egypt in that it was a much sort of newer creation. It was a very diverse population, which needs to be understood, both of religions and of races. There was a Sunni faction, a Shia faction, and a Kurdish faction.
Yeah.
And because of this, whilst there was actually great potential at the time for Iraq to succeed as a nation state, they had several important port cities. They eventually later on became a very oil-rich state, and obviously they had the main rivers connecting through its state between the Indian Ocean and sort of into the Mesopotamia region. Right. So because of this, however, because it was effectively a new state and there wasn't really any sort of sense of unity in the beginning, quite quickly factions began to break out, and the British, as a way to maintain it, tried to sort of pick minorities to pin them against each other, because that made it significantly easier to control a state if they're not united in anger against your protectorate.
Well, Iraq for me seems to be an incredibly textbook example of the British colonial handbook in a sense, because Britain created this sort of arbitrary lines in a map and turned it into a state. And this idea that you've alluded to, Lucian, of pitting the minorities against each other is especially prevalent in Iraq, because when placing people like the Sunni minority in lots of positions of power against the Shia minority, against the Shia majority, you definitely create tensions within the country as opposed to directed at you, the colonial overlord. But I think you did somewhat underplay the role of oil in Britain's initial thinking. So if we cast our minds back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, I believe. No, is it 17? 16, right, thank you. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, essentially, between Britain and France, Britain wanted Iraq because they believed that there was oil to be found there, especially in the Kirkuk oil fields. And if we think about this in the context of Britain's navy shifting from coal to oil, and oil seeming to be the emerging dominant power source of the 20th century, we have to really think about the context of that within within British policy in Iraq. Go on, Harry.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. So even in, more specifically, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1908 heavily relied on Iran for quite a majority of its supplies, especially for the Royal Navy, who were sort of quite active around those regions. So control of Basra in Iraq ensured the security of British oil supplies for the Royal Navy, and obviously under Churchill that became much more of a prevalent issue when they switched from coal to oil. But I think also what sort of underplayed is the protection of India, which I think you alluded to earlier. These sort of Middle Eastern mandates that they were intended to create was such a vital bridge to India, just ensuring that, for example, the Persian Gulf had long been characterised as a British lake that was the defence of British India, and especially under the sort of more contextual thing about competing with the Ottoman Empire in Germany. But I do really agree with what you said earlier about that. It's sort of one of the most textbook examples out of the British handbook, because as Lucian said, putting factions against each other to sort of divide and conquer, to be quite cliche. I think a similar thing happened in the Ulster Plantation with Ireland, as they put a lot of Protestants in control of, say, the economic prosperity that happened there, and a lot of the religious roles. So doing that ensured that they could divide and control without having to be there. So presently it's very difficult as such a small nation to occupy such a large area.
Yeah, it's a good point. There are good points you're making there, Harry, and I just want to kind of draw our attention to oil once more, because it is such an inalienable part of every great power's interaction with the Middle East, because of course it's an incredibly oil-rich region. And with Iraq specifically, there are several main reasons regarding oil why the UK would want to be involved there. So there was a kind of economic crossroads that was facing the UK in terms of whether to devalue the pound in relation to US debt repayments, and there were all sorts of economic problems kind of swirling around. And what seemed to be the answer to their sort of prayers for economic recuperation after the First World War was being able to become the world's leading exporter in this incredibly valuable new commodity. Now, I know this is a bit of an aside, but when we think about which powers tend to have dominated recent history, it's often focused around who has the best access to the predominant energy source at the time. So the 19th century was dominated by Britain because Britain was the best producer of coal. The 20th century was dominated by the US because they had the most access to oil, and of course certain opinion seems to be tended towards the idea that China's dominance over renewables will make it the dominant power of the 21st century. But Britain understood this trend, which is why they wanted to have access to this oil in Iraq. It was so important to them. Leo?
I mean, sorry, coming late, Leo Dacier 13.
Yeah.
Part of that does need to be prefaced. That is quite a lot of retrospective
Yes.
in that analysis. But yeah, that definitely does seem to track. And also, part of the importance of British interest in oil was with their interest being so clearly imperial dominated, imperial cited, this really undermined their credibility to go forth and negotiate in any real capacity. First of all, they absolutely undermined Arab nationalism and Arab independence because fundamentally they didn't make good on their promises and they rather honoured the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And furthermore, when going into then dealing with later issues after the Iraqi revolt in the later interwar years, they just had no real position to argue or to negotiate with because their entire position was ultimately determined by their interest in oil. As an exploitative relationship at that.
Yes.
I'd just like to add another point. When factoring in oil, especially with the mandate, something that should also be understood is militarily, oil was quite literally, the blood that was flowing through the empire's veins, especially after World War One, which completely has a huge blow to the power of Britain at this time. One of the ways they tried to do it is they almost with the mandates tried to do a sort of empire on the cheap, which is through planes and a minimal number of soldiers they can try to control and dominate the mandates. And these planes are mainly now being powered by oil. So it was also the way British military strength was kept alive, and obviously, as seen in World War II, these mandates became absolutely crucial in beating the Nazis and also fascist Italy, as it came down to the oil reserves in Iran and Iraq. Okay, just to follow up on the final point, another key thing to remember when it came to the mandates on how Britain controlled it is they tended, in addition to pinning minorities against each other, they also tended to like to install a sort of puppet king of sorts as a way to sort of create a false unity, but also to make sure there was a loyalist who could always sort of parlay between the two factions.
So Faisal is an example of that in Iraq. Faisal, of course, being the son of Sharif Hussein of the McMahon Hussein correspondence. Now it's an interesting point you raised, Lucian, because it's quite fascinating how the British kind of tailor each style of government within the mandates to what suits their imperial interests. So, for example, in Iraq you have this absolutist king in Faisal, because of course that's important to secure it. Having that kind of centralised leadership is very important to the British in terms of being able to manipulate it to get oil supplies. But when we think about Palestine, which we're going to talk about next, that was far more complicated in the fact that you had two separate ethnic groups that were living there that couldn't seem to agree on a system of government that would suit them in a kind of representative sense. So it was more centralised to British High Commissioner in Iraq, in Palestine, and in Egypt, of course, was a constitutional monarchy. And you have all these different styles of government within the Middle East. Leo?
I think also something important to note is how easy it was for Britain to backtrack on various imperial agreements they made. The Balfour Declaration would be, if they chose to, significantly harder to backtrack on, at least as I clearly think, as they had a massive support in Britain, also in America and wider across the world, for this idea of the Zionist nation, proposed by the Zionists, of course. But with their various agreements in Iraq is obviously the best case study for them backtracking on ideas of Arab independence, but also Egypt for how important the Suez would become in the various agreements and treaties they made. It was just a series of how best could Britain really adapt to their situation and how easily could they backtrack on various policies, which I think defined Britain's stance in the interwar and even the post-war era.
Well, you've led us quite nicely on to talking about the mandate of Palestine by referencing the Balfour Declaration. So does anyone want to talk about British aims for Palestine? Go on, Lucian.
So I think one of the key things to remember about Palestine is during the First World War, to understand the extent of desperation, I think, for Britain when they're sort of in the creation of what later becomes sort of the Palestine Mandate, and then later the State of Israel. Something that's important to remember is just the desperation. They're trying to appeal to Sharif Hussein, and they're trying to appeal to the French with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and they're also now trying to appeal to the sort of Zionist supporters within America and also Britain. And because of this, I think they deliberately try to choose sort of vague, open to interpretation promises and deals to each of these factions, because they're always kind of thinking, basically, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, let's just focus on the war afterwards. And obviously, once finally the Ottoman Empire collapses, they're then sort of met with this, and they try to sort of come up with something that would potentially work for everyone. But obviously, as seen, if you try to please everyone, you'll end up pleasing no one, as over the next 20 years, they're constantly trying to balance out the sort of frustrations of these Arab leaders who feel cheated over the incoming sort of Jewish migration to Palestine, and at the same time, many of the Jewish settlers feel cheated because they feel like they were promised a protectorate state, and yet there's all this friction and tension going on in an area that has incredible religious significance, which shouldn't be underestimated either.
Yes, that's an interesting point you raised, Lucian, but I think something else that's critical to British imperial policy in Palestine, regardless of war per se, is the economic implications, especially since we've already talked about the Suez Canal with regards to Egypt. Palestine has an incredibly close proximity to the Suez Canal, and if we think about the Balfour Declaration, that is promising to implement a Jewish homeland, not necessarily a state or a nation, but a Jewish homeland, a presence of a people who you have given you their own nation set up, which means that in the British kind of psyche, even though they were quite sort of inscrutable with this kind of policy, there would be inevitably some kind of quid pro quo, in the sense that if you are the Jewish nation and this great power has given you your own state or your own place to live, you would invariably owe them a debt of gratitude. Now, that debt of gratitude, in terms of the British, would likely be helping them oversee the Suez Canal, or indeed being a close sort of ear to the ground near the Suez Canal, and making sure their affairs there run smoothly. So there is definitely economic sense behind Britain's adoption of the Balfour Declaration as well as the fact that there was obviously a large Jewish presence in America, with the Jewish lobby there, and the Balfour Declaration would likely have made America more likely to join the war, join World War I at the time, which is definitely an element of their thinking in that sense. So, does anyone want to talk about the British mandate in Jordan as the last one before the end of the episode?
You go.
Go on, Lucian.
So obviously, Jordan, unlike the other states, seems almost unlikely in that it succeeded, but also it can be argued it was arguably the most successful. In that at the time, Jordan was effectively completely sort of made up for practically almost geographical convenience, in that there was sort of no preconceived notion of it. The king they installed was the brother of Faisal in Iraq, of Abdullah of Jordan, who obviously was not a native there. He was actually always campaigning for a different Arab state, but then wound up in Jordan. He was actually even put in, arguably, by the British for a 6-month trial period. However, despite that, and despite the fact that they actually had very little sort of natural economic gifts or benefits or anything like that, they were still able to form a sort of relatively successful state. The Bedouin tribes that were living there at the time were able to work fairly well with King Abdullah of Jordan. They got some good agrarian reforms passing through in what was relatively seen as a slightly almost left behind state during the Ottoman days. And because of this, they were able to have this much better relationship, I think, with the British, where Abdullah of Jordan was much more shrewd in terms of trying to balance and make sure that all factions ultimately didn't sort of tear each other apart and actually built each other and got them stronger. And he was actually, the British trusted him so much they even let him form the Arab Legion, which, even though it was only of 5,000 soldiers, was still incredibly significant if it was a very anti-British movement. And obviously during World War II, because they chose to side with the British, especially on key important frontiers like the Suez Canal, This led to them in 1946 being rewarded with their independence, which obviously we can get to later. But I'd say overall this clearly shows that Jordan had probably the most success.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think a sort of divergence between maybe sort of the other ones we've referenced is I think that in Jordan, Britain were far more successful in their alliances with the local population, as in the local families, for example, the Hashemite family. And I think they were really instrumental in the Arab Revolt, which was against the Ottomans, of course. So quite a judicious British decision to form strong ties with them, as they could sort of destabilise the region for the Ottomans and therefore have that overreaching control, but without the sort of military presence that they couldn't quite afford, as Lucian alluded to earlier, with the empire on the cheap. And I think, for example, the reliance on the Abdullah family as well. I think after the Cairo conference was also pretty well executed. Leo?
I think it's important to notice when comparing, especially to Iraq and Palestine, it was a much more different situation Jordan was faced with, which is why we can partially attribute some of its successes. I mean, if we're comparing it to Iraq, rather than direct influence using advisors, the British control there was indirect via the monarchy and did not have to be looking to backtrack on as much as it was seen they were backtracking in Jordan, because the monarchy still had the monarchy was ultimately the governing body, and because of this and this lack of a united sort of vision that the British were interfering and puppeteering the government, there was a low amount of interference and there was a low amount of resistance when compared to Iraq. But also, I don't think there was quite as much oil to primarily extract, so there was just a much lesser British interest in the region. And when comparing it to Palestine, there was no Balfour Declaration to Jordan.
Yeah.
The slew of issues caused, without imparting moral judgment on literally any of this, a large amount of it was born in part due to the Balfour Declaration and the various amounts of violence faced by the different ethnic groups there. So when looking at Jordan, it's important to note this was probably the most successful, but this was also probably the least touched by any British interference or British governance.
Excellent. Right, well, we hope you have enjoyed this episode of 21 Minutes in the Past. I'm not quite sure what we will be discussing next time, but it might be something to do with either civil rights, Russia.
Civil rights or Russia.
Yes.
Yeah.
So those are interesting topics to come your way, but we hope you've enjoyed listening.